So today we are going to be looking at how to calculate a confidence interval for two independent group data. So it'll follow the same format, we just have a little bit more work because we're trying to compare two groups. So we're going to do a 95% confidence interval looking at the difference between mean hangover symptoms for two different groups of college students. A group of college students who have parents with alcohol problems versus college students who have parents that do not have alcohol problems. So with these problems, it is easiest to deal with positive numbers, and so because of that, you'll want to try to choose group 1 as being the one that has the largest sample mean. And so you can see here that this has a larger sample mean of 5.9. And so then we'll make group 2 the one that has the smaller sample mean. Just makes things easier as we progress. So always the first step is to identify the population. So again, we have two populations because we have two groups, and the first group is going to be all students with parents. And to save myself some writing, I'm going to put with alcohol problems, so AP, shortening that to AP. And then my second group is going to be all students, and it will be the second population, or the one with the smaller sample mean. So this would be with parents without alcohol problems. Again, shortening alcohol problems to just AP. So then the samples are going to correspond. So my first sample is going to be the 282 students with parents with alcohol problems. And then the second sample is going to be the 945 students with parents without. So again, if I were to define my parameter of interest here, which is beneficial once we get to making our inference, we have mu1 minus mu2, so that's our parameter, or the notation for our parameter. And the first group is going to correspond to what we have written up here as population 1. So it would be mean hangover symptoms, and I'm just going to shorten that to HOS, for students with parents with alcohol problems. And to emphasize that that's my first group, I'm going to put mu1 in parentheses behind it, and then I'll state my second mean. So mean hangover symptoms for students with parents without alcohol problems. So that's helpful when we get to making our interpretation of the confidence interval to have already written our parameter definition. So we'll now move into step 2, which is stating our assumptions. And if you remember from what we talked about in hypothesis testing, we have to assume for these problems that the sampling distribution for x bar 1 minus x bar 2 is normal. And to verify that, we have conditions that we have to check. And so in step 3, when we check our conditions, we either have to have large sample size, or both samples have to be from populations that are normal, and the populations have to be independent. Well, both have very large sample sizes, so 282 and 945 is large enough, so both samples are large. And we can assume that the populations are independent, because I wouldn't expect the hangover symptoms for students who have parents with alcohol problems to affect students with parents without. So next we'll move into step 4. So now moving into step 4, we have to identify all of the pieces of calculating the confidence interval. So the first one is to identify your sample estimates. And so here it's x bar 1 minus x bar 2, and we're shown up here that our x bar 1 is 5.9 minus x bar 2, which is 4.9. So then in letter B, we're going to find our multiplier. So using that T-star multiplier table, we have 95% as our confidence level, and then we're going to use the 100 degree of freedom because we'll have to round down, and we're still using that conservative degree of freedom calculation. So remember that conservative degree of freedom calculation is the smaller n minus 1. So our smaller n is 282 minus 1. So technically we have 281 degrees of freedom, but those T-star tables don't go up to that, and so we'll be using the 100 degree of freedom row. Oops. So that actually is a 1.98 T-star multiplier. So then in C, we're going to calculate standard error of the x bar 1 minus x bar 2. And that formula, remember, is s sub 1 squared over n sub 1 plus s sub 2 squared over n sub 2. So plugging in the values that are stated up here, we have 3.6 as s sub 1, and we'll square that value, divided by 282. And then we have 3.4 squared over 945. So if you plug that all in, you come up with a standard error equal to 2.4. So then when you calculate margin of error, remember that that's the T-star times standard error. So we have 1.98 times the standard error we just calculated. So we'll come up with a margin of error equal to 0.48. So then finally, when we calculate our confidence interval, we have x bar 1 minus x bar 2 plus or minus the margin of error. And so we'll have 5.9 minus 4.9 plus or minus 0.48. So 1 plus or minus 0.48. And then we come up with an interval ranging from 0.52 up to 1.48. So remember, because you're comparing groups and 0 isn't included, there is in fact a difference in mean hangover symptoms. And in step 5, we'll make that interpretation. So then the very final step is step 5, which is making the interpretation. So we're going to start with how confident we are. And for this problem, remember we were trying to be 95% confident. So we are 95% confident. And then what we're going to do is take the parameter that we defined in step 1, but instead of having that minus section, we're going to put the interval in that location. So here we're 95% confident. The mean hangover symptoms for students with parents with alcohol problems is between, and as I said, instead of having the minus, this is where we're going to put the interval. So it's between 0.52 and 1.48. And normally you would put units, but for this problem there are no units, so that's where you would put them. And we'll say higher because our interval is positive. So it's between 0.52 and 1.48 units higher. And then we'll state our second mean. So then mean hangover symptoms for students with parents without alcohol problems. So again, because you're comparing two groups and because we saw an interval that did not include 0, where 0 would indicate that there was no difference, we're going to interpret this interval and say how much difference you see. And so here we're 95% confident that mean hangover symptoms for students with parents with alcohol problems will be between 0.52 and 1.48 units higher than those without.